Do you ever feel like you need to ask permission for your own future? I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and thanks so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. Joining me today is thought leader, writer, and Bible teacher, Ashlee Eiland. She exists to join in God's redemptive work here on earth. You are going to love our conversation and her parable about her choice to take the cup God had before her.
That was the first time I really felt like this is who God's made me to be. Because in that moment, I didn't feel fear. I felt like this is an appropriately fitting mantle. It didn't feel out of place.
Here's my conversation with Ashlee Eiland. I am so excited to introduce you to Ashlee. I think one of the things I really admire about you, what I've noticed about you, Ashlee, is that you are an encourager. One of our last podcasts we did with Women's Speaker Collective, you just put out this challenge. If you see something in another woman, tell her, even if you don't know her. I mean, that's the heart that I have for other women as well. And so with that, thank you so much for being with us today.
Danielle, thanks for having me. This is a joy. It's an honor to be with you again.
Of course. Okay. So I am curious. You had something on your Instagram is I don't like telling people what I do. I'm in an era of how to be, which feels a little Taylor Swift, but I was like, this feels really good because I think for a lot of us, we're like, here's what I'm doing rather than here is who I am. So I'd love to know, Ashlee, what is who you are right now?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it is very Taylor of me to write something like this, especially on the other side of her new album just dropping. I feel like I'm coming out of a season of deep grief, being honest, and a season of loss. And that season did a number on me. I feel like I wrestled a lot with how I was existing in the world, the rhythms that I was walking through in life. All of that got disrupted. Everything from work to our family rhythms to just even my own self-care rhythms and how I was spending time with God. All of it got turned on its head. And I found myself making decisions to really push pause on pretty much everything from stepping out of full-time ministry as a pastor to saying, I just need a couple months of rest, of the land lying fallow. And if you take that image of a field that's fallow, if you take this image of land that is resting, it looks pretty boring, but there's a lot happening beneath the surface. And I feel like that's what's happening in my being right now, where you or someone might look at my life and be like, oh, looks pretty standard. I'm back in a working rhythm. I'm never taking a break from being a mom or a parent. You know, there's family responsibilities, friends, work. But underneath the surface, I feel like there's this rebirth happening in coming from a place where a lot was stripped back and really raw and vulnerable, and how I was talking to God and communing with God, evaluating my emotional life, my thought life alongside it, and going, there's really deep work happening here. Yeah. So I feel like now more than ever before, I'm in a season of surrender and not in a hands-off way where there's nothing I'm doing. God, do whatever you want. It's participatory. I'm participating in my own healing by taking time to still pay attention to what's happening within. And that has been a challenge, but it's been so fruitful. It is so hard, but it's been so good.
I like what you said, there's that underlying nature to it. And then when we surrender, it's not just I'm just going to lay here and see what happens. Because I think for many of us, we think, okay, when we just surrender, we're just going to stay here and see, God, you do your thing. He wants to participate in that relationship with us. And how are we going to go into those hard spaces? Because it's crappy sometimes. You have to go through it and really dig deep and make it a part of your life. When you talked about resting, has there been something that has surprised you? Oh, wow, actually, this really gives me such rest. And maybe that's napping, but I know there's so many different forms of rest.
Yeah, I have read more books this year already than I did all of last year. And there's something about engaging other people's creativity and the stories that other people tell that's quite beautiful to me. I feel like I am in awe of how people choose to form these 26 letters in our English alphabet into these various stories and narratives and tales. And I feel like for me, whenever I am able to put myself to be in awe of humanity, that feels really restful. I did a coaching session with a wonderful guy named Jay Parsons. He coaches these life plan sessions. And what we realized, part of the life plan is you come to this place after 2 days of saying, this is why I'm here on earth. And you can say it in 12 words or less. And I realized part of who I am is I'm a beauty expander. Like I love seeing beauty and expanding it and not necessarily making the beauty different, but being in awe and allowing that beauty to be more expansive in me and in community and to take up space. And so whether it's reading a book, I love reading, or I found like our family has a subscription to our local art museum.
Okay.
Not because our family loves doing the art museum, but because I love it. I love walking around by myself in silence, beholding. So the act of beholding for me, Danielle, has become really restful. And I feel like it fills me up in a way that sometimes even a good nap can't.
Absolutely. Are you familiar with Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith and her, like, the 7 types of sacred rest? She opened my eyes. When I read her book, I was like, oh, that helps me so much recognize it isn't, while I love a good 17-minute nap, there is so much more out there. So what you said, the beauty expander and like beholding something, that's so cool. What could you tell us, like, what has been one image that has stood out at the museum that it was like, oh, this is really getting me right now?
It's part of the permanent installation at the Grand Rapids Art Museum, or the Graham, and it's called TIR, T-I-R. And it's this piece by a woman who took these different parts of mirrors, broken mirrors, and she put them together in these identical shapes. And some of the mirror pieces are clear, some are red, some have like a yellowish or goldish tone to them, some are silver. And you can arrange these different mosaic pieces into different shapes. So the museum has it in one variation, but you could make really infinite possibilities and shapes with these different mosaic pieces of broken mirror. And I just feel like whenever I consider, particularly in the past year, when I've considered the loss and the brokenness in my own life, when I look outside myself and see the brokenness of humanity and how we hurt each other and how we're selfish, we're not generous, I see in her artwork what God does with us, God does with our lives, what God does with humankind, to take brokenness and to repurpose it into something that reflects his goodness and the coming glory of his kingdom. So it's my favorite piece, and doesn't matter what the other installations are in that museum, but I feel like I always come to that one piece and have a really powerful reflective moment with it.
I like how it is interactive too, where I think art speaks to so many different levels of each person, but just to make it your own and to see that, like reflection looking back. I mean, I could use that in so many message analogies right now.
Absolutely. And I used it for a sermon last year because I felt like when you're talking to a group of people, they're all coming with their own stuff, and we're not having the same human experience at any point in time. And so that's what I love about art, that it reaches us where we are and can be powerful and meaningful no matter what we're experiencing.
Yeah. You are a mom. You have 3 kids, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. As you walk through this season, like, how has that helped you navigate just being a mom, like their emotions, the joys and the hardships too? Yeah,
it's such a good question. I feel like I'm constantly having to remind myself that my kids have only been on this earth for a fraction of the time that I've been on this earth. I had that thought last night. In fact, our son was having a hard time, and I had to say to myself, he's only been here for 8 years.
Oh, that's so good.
And so for me to place expectations on him, to be able to navigate his own emotions or even communal life in a way that is matured and that has the benefit of experience over 3 to 4 decades in a little 8-year-old body is so unfair to him. And so I feel like walking through my own brokenness and giving myself grace and being patient with myself, particularly, I mean, grief is a beast that is untamable. There's no perfect formula or recipe for how to make sense of it. I feel like coming into that truth for my own self has helped me maintain a patience and a presence with my kids in a way in this season that I've never done before. And in some ways it's harder because there's more that I'm noticing, and there are more opportunities for me to turn the mirror on myself and excavate and interrogate my own parenting. There are more opportunities for shame in that way. But the gift is that there are more opportunities, again, for beholding who God is making them to be, what they're navigating in their minds and in their friend life, and even here at home. Like, wow, I get to be a part of what's shaping and forming this new thing, taking these pieces and helping them make sense of them. So I feel like coming out of that season, I'm more available to them in that way.
Gosh, that is such a helpful reminder. Eric and I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old who believe that they've been around on this earth forever and they know what's up.
Right.
But yeah, that it's the setting of expectations and recognizing, even just in parenting, if you don't have kids, in any relationship, truly, of like, what do they know? What do they not know? Because it takes off that burden and gives us a sense of freeness as we're talking and communicating with one another.
Yes.
That's 100%. So good. I do. And when you were talking about like sharing your grief with your children, I do remember a time. I'm a crier by general. Like that's just, I love to cry, release the toxins over and over. But one time I was saying something to my daughter and she's just like, well, I can't help that I'm not perfect like you. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I must not be sharing these hard pieces of my life or either glossing over it or expanding upon them to let them know like, hey, yeah, I am feeling this. This has been hard. So that has really been a change or a switch in parenting of just saying, if I'm having a crap day, I'm going to let you know about it. So,
yes. Let them in. I love that.
All right. Well, Ashlee, I know you are kind of have a poet's heart. You really you love to write. And we're going to talk about your book in a little bit, but I'd love to hear about one of your parable stories.
Oh, I can't wait to let everyone in on this one because it's something I hadn't thought about for a while. But in my first career, I worked in human resources for Nestle USA, the candy company. And after leaving the Los Angeles area, they transferred me to Chicagoland, where I supported the Wonka factory. So in our factory wasn't the chocolate factory. We made all the hard, sweet candies like Nerds, Runts, Sweethearts, Nerds Rope, some of those candy options. And I remember I started attending a large church out in Chicagoland, found really beautiful community there. And as a part of that community in our early 20s, we would volunteer for the high school ministry events. And one such event was a summer camp at Indiana Wesleyan University called Sandblast. And as I was volunteering, here I have this corporate HR job, volunteering at this high school camp in the competition area. So running games and stuff like that. I remember standing in the back of the auditorium when the camp speaker was giving their presentation and teaching the camp. And he was teaching out of John 2, Jesus' first miracle at the wedding at Cana. And it's one of the only times I feel like I've heard the audible voice of God. And this isn't the parable piece. This isn't the punchline. We're getting there. But I feel like Holy Spirit spoke and said, would you do this? Would you take the cup I'm giving you and walk with it? And I feel like I didn't know at that time what it meant to work for a church. I hadn't ever had it on my bucket list to be in full-time ministry. And I just remember saying, okay, yeah, God, I will take the cup that you're giving me because I don't know what's in here, but I trust that you're going to make something of it. It's like it blows my mind that those servants trusted Jesus enough that on the way they would trust that something would happen and that water would be turned to wine by the time they got to the master of the banquet. So fast forwarding a little bit, I ended up telling my small group leader, he was like, well, let's pray and see what happens. And lo and behold, there's a ministry director who is stepping down. The new person steps in and says, I need a director of operations. I feel like it was an opportunity for me to step into ministry in that way. However, I had this moment, Danielle, where I was like, my parents, who both worked their heinies off, both had really amazing jobs in corporate America. They did very well for themselves. My mother just slayed left and right, all these sorts of barriers and obstacles in her way as sometimes the only woman in the room, sometimes the only person of color in the room, sometimes both. My dad was an international salesman traveling all over the place. My parents worked so hard to put me through a very good school. And here I am considering completely switching career directions and trading in a corporate job for life in ministry full time. And I remember having this moment I've got to tell them that this is what I'm thinking. I can't not tell them. They've got to know that this is what's happening. So I remember on my lunch break at Nestle, Danielle, I drove to Panera Bread and I parked my car outside Panera and I said, I got to call my dad. I got to tell him. I remember being this is going to go so badly. They're going to be so mad at me. They're going to think this is a total waste. They're going to think I'm crazy. And I called my dad and I can still remember what I was wearing. I was wearing my navy blue Nestle shirt with the Stitch logo on it. I was wearing my navy blue pants and I probably had my steel toe shoes on. And I said, Dad, I think I'm going to quit my job and work for a church. And he said to me, after a long silence, it was probably only a few seconds. It felt like minutes. He said, well, Ashlee, if God is calling you to do something, don't let me be the one to get in the way.
Wow. Dad.
The second he said that, I broke and I started weeping because I realized even though I don't think I needed their permission, but there was something about my father's affirmation that I needed to step confidently into the place that God was calling me to be. And my dad passed last year. And that's one of the stories I remember because it taught me a couple things. One, I want to live my life in a way that clears the way for other people to step fully into the things God is calling them to do. I do not want to be a barrier to anyone else's yes and obedience to God. And my dad modeled that so beautifully in giving me those words of permission. But second, I feel like that was the first time of many that conversation gave me the confidence to step into an unknown place, to carry the cup of which I knew nothing about. And Danielle, I can't explain it, but almost every major transition in my life has been marked by that, has been marked by an unknown, a question mark. I have no idea how this is going to go. What the heck am I doing? But because I have my father's voice in my head and in my heart, that has lifted the burden of fear and has given me confidence to step fully into the thing I feel like God is leading me to do. So not only do I not want to be a barrier, but I want to keep being someone who says yes confidently to really scary unknown things because I have my father's affirmation. And I no longer have my earthly dad's affirmation. But I feel like my relationship with God has shifted to say, God, you as my father, this is one of the ways that you operate in my life as my father. You give me your affirmation. You call me into unknown places, but I have you. I have your presence. I have your voice. And therefore I have everything I need.
Ashlee, I appreciate you sharing that story because I think so many of us can relate to the next step, the next question, the fear of the unknown, whether that is a job or a relationship or a big decision, a transition in our life. And there's this element of fear. And I love how you connected that to your father's voice, to your earthly father, and then also your heavenly father.
Yeah.
How that means so much. Sometimes we need that affirmation, Dad, is this the right way I need to go? When you said, would you take this cup? If you can reflect back, prior to that season, had there been any nudges, any inklings, or was that really the big one that you can remember?
That was the big one. I had been encouraged before that by my small group leader and by another pastor and encouraged in my leadership to say, Ashlee, you're a leader. And I remember our small group at that time had gotten so large. We were fitting 40 something people into this tiny apartment in downtown Arlington Heights. Wow. And we got to a place where we needed to create a different group. And our small group leader said, Ashlee, would you lead this second group? Mm-hmm. So there were tiny nudges. And even in my childhood and coming up through high school, I think I knew I had a leadership gift. I also knew that there was something about my relationship with Jesus that was so, so important to me and very precious to me that, you know, I'm not surprised that that's where I ended up. But I think the first moment of like, okay, this is getting real. Yeah. Your life is going to take a turn. in a direction that because you know what it's like. You come up through school and then the next predictable thing for most people is like you go to college. And then it seems like you have a lot of freedom in college, but it's actually a very structured environment. And then you graduate and you're like, now I need to adult and I don't actually know how to do that. Like no one's given me a manual. Like most of my life before that had been really structured. So it was the first time I felt like I was making the decision. Yeah. Even though I had been encouraged before and spiritual gifts had been called out and I was called up into using those gifts of leadership and teaching. I feel like that moment for me was a trust moment. It was less about what I was going to do and whether or not I was going to trust God.
I think that word permission, I don't know if that's for everyone, but there is something about me that like sometimes, depending on what it is, like I feel like I need that sense of permission, whether that is from a father figure, whether that is from my own husband, even my kids, and or God. Like, why do you think that word permission or that feeling holds so much weight for us?
I think at our best, we truly want to do what is right and good. And we've been afforded the sense of agency where, particularly when you're talking about the will of God, you want to do what God wills, and you also know you have your own human will. And so I think for me in that moment, and even still, permission is less about like, oh, I need someone else to direct my path. Like I need someone else to tell me whether or not I'm doing the right thing. And it's more about, God, if I'm about to do something that is not what you have for me, like, please stop me. Rarely will I pray for clarity because most of life is not clear. If I'm being honest, like, I feel like I'm making it all up as I go. So I'll rarely pray for clarity, but I will pray. And even in a recent season, I prayed like, God, if this is what you don't want me to do, I need you to slam some doors. I need you to like, stop me now. Because I'm examining my inner life, my thought life, how I feel. I'm taking all of this data and going, I think this is the right thing. But would you give me some affirmation, confirmation? I would throw permission in there to step fully into this next chapter.
Absolutely. For somebody who is walking in a time where they feel like God is saying, like, here's your cup, will you drink of it? What would be your encouragement to them when they're like struggling with that fear of like, should I take it? Because you said like everything from that moment like has poured out of that cup. So what would be your encouragement to them?
I can't remember the specific book of the Bible this comes from, but I remember when my husband and I were discerning to move to Michigan, we were reading the Old Testament. It's from one of the Old Testament prophets, I think one of the major prophets. And this might not be verbatim, but the sense in that passage was, God is with you if you stay, and God is with you if you go. So my encouragement would be to remember, whether you turn to the left or the right, you will hear a voice saying, this is the way, walk in it. Like, God is with you. You cannot make a decision so big or so different that will prevent God from going with you and going before you. So just go. Just go, because God is with you.
Well, Ashlee, since that parking lot at Panera, you have gone on to a lot of ministry things, and you're about to just launch your second book. So God has been good. And I think that you say on your website, like, this is a part of who you are, that you want to be a truth teller and encourage people to build that relationship with God and with each other. What is your newest book about, and what is your hope for the reader?
So my newest book is about being able to discern and know with confidence what to say and when, and to really come into this elevated assuredness of the voice God has given you and knowing how to steward that voice what I hope for the reader, because this book Say Good is coming out amidst a lot of tension. I mean, we are months away from what's sure to be and what already is a contentious presidential election here in the United States. My prayer is that readers would put that book down after flipping those pages and say, okay, I have a peace now. I no longer have to be afraid. Mm-hmm. I no longer have to wonder, should I speak up in that instance? Or should I say that at the family table? Should I stand up at the PTA meeting? Should I post this opinion online? I feel like I want the reader to know there is an accessibility that can kind of undergird us and put wind in our sails as we figure out how to navigate cultural tensions and complex situations around us. It's meant to be used, written in. It's meant to be a tool, not just a relic for your bookshelves. It's meant to be used and practical and helpful. So that's what I hope. I hope the reader walks away with a sense of hope and peace and confidence in how they use their voices.
Ashlee's book is called Say Good, Speaking Across Hot Topics, Complex Relationships, and Tense Situations. We probably never experienced that.
Never. So irrelevant.
I think what I liked from the description is that there is a level of discernment. And I think that is an art that is lost. I know I still struggle with that. I mean, we're talking about like just our life in general. There's a discernment of like, what's my next steps, but also discernment in our conversations. Is this the time? Is this the place? Is this the person? And so I like that you put that framework in there. Have you felt like discernment is something that you have like grown into, or you're still trying to figure that out for yourself?
Absolutely still trying to figure it out, Danielle. I feel like this path is a lot like our discipleship. We're never done because even as we grow, there will be new headlines, situations, unknowns to navigate that we've never faced before. So the work is never done. I've surely learned a lot, I'd say, and I've learned a lot about patience and the gift of silence and waiting in this work of knowing when to speak and when. And each of the 4 pillars is meant to serve as a framework, a lens through which we see how we show up in the world with our voices. But the work is absolutely never done. And I am so on the journey still in learning how to steward my own voice.
When you think back, I mean, utilizing your voice, when was maybe like the first time you realized this is Ashlee's voice and it can be used for good? It has power in it. Do you remember a time that stuck out to you?
I do. And as you started asking the question, I had a baby panic moment because I'm like, I don't know. And then as you finished the question, it's like, oh, I do know. In high school, I was elected student body president at our small Catholic all-girls high school. In my senior year, and this is a trigger warning for our listeners, but my senior year, I needed to give a speech to the whole high school student body, freshmen through seniors, after a freshman died by suicide. She was someone I knew, and our school was grieving. It was very unexpected. I can't remember who asked me to do this, but they said, Ashlee, would you address the student body at assembly?
Wow.
And I remember Danielle going, sure. Now looking back, I have bigger feels now about that moment than I did in the moment. I think I was just living in it. I didn't realize the gravitas, the weightiness of that. But I remember writing words of hope down on my compact computer, printing them out, and standing before probably some 200 students and teachers and giving a speech about Brandy's life and speaking words of hope. And as I look back at that moment and I go, that was the first time I really felt like this is who God's made me to be. Because in that moment, I didn't feel fear. I felt like this is an appropriately fitting mantle. It didn't feel out of place. It didn't feel like the burden was too heavy or the yoke was too heavy. And that is, you know, when I encourage people, like, look back at who you've always been, despite the changes, despite the people who come in and out of your life, like what has always been true about you. And that's a moment where I can point to and say, yeah, that's always been true.
That's so good and so helpful to reflect and just really like step into the spaces where God like brings back those memories to us. And you're kind of like, why? But there's something in it. Like there's such treasure in our memories of how God has utilized places and people and speeches in our life. Ashlee, as we're wrapping up, I'd love to ask you, what do you think your dad would think about Say Good?
Oh, goodness. I really think he'd be proud of me. But in terms of the book itself, I think he would see glimpses of how he raised me in the pages. I can picture his smile now. He wasn't a man of too many words. He and I always had the shortest conversations on the phone, whereas my mom and I would want to talk for a really long time. And I could hear him in the background going like, okay, Vicky, let her go. But I feel like he would see the book and say, that's it. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, Ashlee, thank you so much for sharing your heart authentically with us. All the ways that God has interwoven himself into your own parable stories. There's so much. And I guess that's why I love that so much, where God, he just uses everything. He uses everything and our stories do matter. Yeah. If people wanted to pick up Say Good or get connected with you, how can they do that?
All the things are at ashleeeiland.com on my website, but I'm most active on social media at Ashlee_Eiland, particularly Instagram. And then I'd encourage readers too, for additional resources, walking the path of reconciliation and conflict transformation, absolutely pick up the book, but I'd also recommend my dear friends at the Colossian Forum. It's a local nonprofit here that's doing the hard, good work of Christian conflict transformation. And they have resources for groups, schools, other nonprofits, and leaders. So if that's a road that you're wanting to travel faithfully, I'd absolutely look them up and invite them into your season and your journey.
Well, Ashlee, thank you so much for sharing yourself with us on the Parable Podcast.
Danielle, it's been an honor. Thank you for having me.
I hope you loved that conversation as much as I did with Ashlee. She talked about in the beginning that she was a beauty expander. And just in that conversation, you can just see beauty expanding in all of the questions. It was so good. To connect with Ashlee or grab her book, Say Good, out now, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Ashlee. Number 1, I'd love for you to read through John 2, which she referenced back in her parable, and spend some time pondering, what is the cup that God wants you to take up for yourself? Number 2, have you felt trapped in fear because you didn't get permission? I'd love for you to prayerfully consider what next steps are on your plate and have the confidence that your Father is with you through whatever one you take. Thanks to my brilliant producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so great. That is going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God will always provide you with your Father's affirmation. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.